Josiah Fenn set the money on the table between them, $4 silver and a column of dimes, and told her the arrangement was finished. Ada stood near the stove, with her hands still floury from the morning biscuits. The dough was on the board behind her, rolled and cut, 18 rounds ready for the oven, and the kitchen smelled of rendered lard and warm flour, and the last of the sage she had dried from the garden in August. She did not wipe her hands. She did not move. Nate sat at the far end of the table with his school slate balanced across his knees. He had set her a place again. Plate, cup, fork turned tines left, the way his mother had always placed her own. He had been doing it every morning for 3 months without being asked, and he performed the act before anyone else was awake, so that by the time Josiah came downstairs, the place existed as if the table itself had produced it. "It's over between us." The words came out level and rehearsed. Josiah had practiced them on the porch while the coffee water heated, pacing the boards in his stocking feet so the sound would not carry, and they still did not sound like something a man should have to say to a woman who had done nothing wrong. Ada wiped her hands on the cloth at her waist. She stood very still, and when she spoke her voice dropped so low that Josiah had to turn his whole body toward her to hear it. "But I never told you what I did that night." Nate set the slate face down on his knees. He placed both palms flat on top of it, pressing something out of sight against the wool of his trousers. He watched his father. He watched Ada. He did not leave. That was the second Wednesday of October, 1879, on 80 acres of deeded grass 11 miles west of Fort Pierre in the Dakota Territory, and the thing Ada Kral had done that night was about to change the terms of every arrangement Josiah had made since his wife died. She had come to the place 6 months earlier on a referral from the Lutheran Ladies' Aid in Yankton. The terms were plain. A woman of 29, without family and without situation, would keep house for a widowed cattleman with 1 child in exchange for room, meals, and $3 a month. The Aid Society's letter had stated, in the careful penmanship of a woman accustomed to preventing misunderstanding, that the position carried no expectation beyond labor and shelter. And the word expectation had been underlined. Josiah had read the letter twice, folded it along the original creases, and placed it in the deed box on the shelf above the bed, because he kept every document that described an obligation. He had needed someone. He would not have said so, but the house had been saying it for him in every room for 16 months. Anarchy had been dead since the June before Ada's arrival, carried off by a fever that swept through the river settlements and took 4 people from the county in 11 days. In the months after, the kitchen accumulated a film of grease on every surface. The garden nodded with bindweed until the onion rose vanished entirely. The preserving jars from the previous autumn clouded and went rank, and Josiah poured their contents into the yard one evening in January and stood looking at the stain in the snow and understood that he had wasted 40 pounds of good pork and 12 quarts of tomatoes because he had not known that preserves must be checked and resealed. Nate ate fried salt pork and cold Johnny cake 3 meals a day because those were the only 2 things Josiah could prepare without spoiling. He burned the Johnny cake on one side more mornings than not, scraping the blackened crust with a knife before setting it on the boy's plate, and Nate ate it without comment, which was worse than any complaint would have been, because a complaint would at least have acknowledged that something was wrong. In every other respect, Josiah was competent. He ran 140 head of mixed cattle on leased government grass, owned the 80 acres under the house and barn outright, and could fence, shoe, ride, rope, mend harness, split wood, and build anything that stood still long enough to be measured. He could read a cow's condition from 50 yards by the way she carried her head, and he could predict weather by the color of the sky above the river bluffs with better accuracy than any almanac the mercantile sold. What he could not do, and what he had concealed from every rancher and townsman in the county since the day of Anaki's funeral, was doctor a sick animal. Anaki had done all the doctoring. She had brought the knowledge from her father's farm in Dodge County, Wisconsin, where he had kept 60 head of dairy cattle and 4 Percheron draft horses, and had treated every ailment himself because the nearest veterinarian charged more per visit than a week of hired labor. She had learned by watching him, and then by doing. And by the time she married Josiah at 19, she could lance an abscess, drench a calicking horse, set a calf's dislocated shoulder, mix a sulfur wash for rain rot, and diagnose the cause of lameness by running her hands down a limb the way a piano tuner diagnoses a string by touch. She had maintained the medicine chest in the back room, a pine box with a sliding lid that held the turpentine and the blue vitriol and the colic drench ingredients and the hoof salve and a sharp lancet wrapped in oiled cloth. Every bottle was labeled in her handwriting. The chest smelled of her hands, camphor and linseed and clean cotton, and after she died, Josiah could not open the lid because the smell would come out and she would not be behind it. He had never asked her to teach him. She had never offered. The knowledge had lived in her body the way music lives in a singer's throat, as a thing so native it never occurs to the owner that it could be lost. Since her death, he had been paying Doc Stroud in Fort Pierre $5 a visit. Stroud was a horse doctor first, a cattle doctor by extension, and a businessman in all seasons. In 16 months, Josiah had called him 11 times and paid him $85, more than he had spent on seed and flour combined. The money was not catastrophic, but it was constant, and it was the kind of spending that told a story to anyone who studied the accounts. Ada arrived on a Thursday in April with 1 carpetbag and a pair of work boots tied together by the laces and hung over her shoulder. By Friday, she had scrubbed the kitchen floor to pale wood, working on her hands and knees with lye soap and a brush, and Josiah came in at midday and did not recognize the room. By Sunday, the garden was cleared to bare soil. Every root of bindweed pulled and piled for burning, and she had planted onion sets and late turnips and 2 rows of radishes in lines so straight they could have been laid with a surveyor's chain. She discovered the ruined preserves and said nothing. She found the grease on the stove hood and removed it with a paste of ash and water. She mended Nate's shirts with stitches so even they resembled machine work, and she shortened the sleeves on 2 of them because the boy had grown since anyone last paid attention. She moved through the house with the particular economy of a woman who understood that she occupied space on terms that could be revoked, and that the way to remain was to become necessary without becoming visible. Nate watched her for 5 days without speaking. On the 6th morning, he brought her a fistful of pasque flowers from the bluff behind the barn, the first wildflowers of the Dakota spring, lavender and pale against his brown hand. He put them in a tin cup on the kitchen sill and walked out without turning around. Ada filled the cup with water. She set it where the early light would reach it. She did not tell him they were pretty. She did not call them sweet. She treated the flowers as a fact, a thing that had been placed and would remain, and that was the only treatment an 8-year-old boy could have accepted without wishing he had not done it. By the 2nd week, he had attached himself to her routines. Not underfoot. Not interfering. He positioned himself where he could observe her hands, and when she reached for something, he retrieved it before she could name it. He carried firewood to the kitchen stove in loads too heavy for his arms, making 2 trips where 3 would have been sensible, because he was proving something to himself about his own usefulness. He gathered eggs in his hat because she had mentioned once, not to him, but to the air near the stove, that eggs rode better in something soft. He began waiting on the porch step in the mornings, already booted, his collar buttoned, and when she came out, he fell into step beside her and walked with her to the henhouse in the grave silence of a boy who had taken on a responsibility he intended to keep. He started setting her place at the table. Not in the morning when Josiah could see him do it, but sometime in the darkness before dawn. Patting downstairs in his socks and arranging the plate and cup and fork with the deliberate care of a child performing a ritual whose rules he had invented and would not explain. The fork always went tines left. The cup always faced the same direction. He never mentioned it. Neither did Ada. Neither did Josiah, who noticed it every morning and put the place setting back in the cupboard every evening for the first week, until the repetition wore through his resistance and he stopped removing it, and the plate stayed. Josiah saw every piece of it. The flowers in their tin cup. The boy at the porch step, booted and waiting. The eggs delivered in his hat. The place that appeared at the table as though it had grown there overnight. He saw the way Nate arranged himself at supper so that his chair sat closer to Ada's end of the table than to his father's, not by a distance that announced itself, but by enough to make a geometry of preference visible to anyone who cared to read it. He said nothing about any of it. He had built a long practice of keeping silent about things that would require him to feel something, and the practice had carried him through 16 months of solitary grieving and $85 of veterinary debt, and a son who had stopped bringing him any subject that touched the heart. The doctoring revealed itself in the 8th week. One of the spring heifers came in from the south grass, dragging her left hind leg, the hock swollen tight and hot, the animal grunting with each step. Josiah brought her into the corral and studied the leg. The joint was distended. The skin over the hock was taut and shiny. He put his hand on it and felt the heat come through his palm like something alive, and he knew, with the flat certainty of a man confronting a truth he has been avoiding, that he did not understand what he was touching. The swelling could be a strained ligament. It could be a fracture below the joint. It could be an infection seated by a wire cut hidden in the fold above the fetlock. Anarchy would have known by touch. She would have flexed the joint and pressed the capsule and checked the hoof and given her diagnosis in the same calm voice she used to describe the weather. He could do none of it. He was calculating the $5 it would cost to bring Stroud out, plus the half-day lost, when Ada came across the yard carrying the water yoke balanced on her shoulders, a full bucket at each end. She set the yoke down. She studied the heifer from 3 paces, reading the animal's posture, the distribution of weight, the angle of the swollen joint. Then she stepped into the corral and knelt beside the heifer and ran both hands along the leg from stifle to hoof with the specific, sequential pressure of a diagnostic examination. Her fingers pressed the joint capsule at 2 points. She flexed the fetlock and extended it. She picked up the hoof and checked the sole with her thumbnail, scraping a line through the packed dirt to test the sensitivity of the frog. Strained the lateral ligament. Not broken. She caught it in a gopher hole from the angle of the swelling. The heat will go down in 4 or 5 days if she stays penned and off uneven ground. Cold water compresses twice a day, morning and evening, 20 minutes each, wrung tight and changed when they warm. She stood and wiped her hands on her apron and met his eyes, and what she did not say mattered more than the diagnosis. She did not say he should have known. She did not name the gap between what the place required and what he could provide. She allowed the gap to exist as a private thing between them, and the privacy of it was a kindness so precise that it could only have come from someone who understood what it cost a man to be seen in his insufficiency. He let her treat the heifer. He did not ask where she had learned. She did not offer the information. The heifer walked sound in 5 days. After that, he stopped calling Stroud. When a calf scoured in June, Ada mixed the drench from linseed oil and chalk and administered it with a bottle and a length of rubber tubing. holding the calf's head steady with one hand while she controlled the flow with the other. When the gray mare developed rain rot along her spine in July, Ada compounded a sulfur wash from powdered sulfur and rendered lard and applied it with a clean rag every morning and evening until the scabs lifted and the new skin came in pink and sound. She opened Aniki's medicine chest without asking permission. She used what was inside. She replaced what she used from her own wages, purchasing turpentine and camphor and vitriol from the mercantile and recording each item in a small lined notebook she kept in her apron pocket, a running account of what the place owed her that she presented to no one. Josiah never opened the medicine chest himself. He never entered the back room while she was working. They had arrived at an understanding that required no speech and no acknowledgement, and the understanding was entire. She carried the thing he could not carry. He allowed it. Neither of them gave it a name. On a Saturday morning in September, Doc Stroud rode out to the place unannounced. He tied his horse at the porch rail and came up the steps with his leather bag in one hand and his account book in the other. Josiah met him at the door. Stroud was a tall man with clean fingernails and a way of surveying property that resembled assessment more than greeting. His eyes moved across the corral, the barn, the healthy stock in the near pasture, and came to rest on Josiah with a question already formed. "Haven't had a call from you since that foot rot in April, Fen. 5 months of silence from a man who was sending for me every 3 weeks is a notable thing." Healthy year. 5 months healthy. On 140 head. Stroud opened the account book. "You still owe $12 from winter. I let it carry because you were steady, but I confess the quiet has made me curious. I will bring the 12 to town by the end of the month. I would be grateful. But I am also wondering who has been doing your doctoring. Somebody has. Your stock is in better condition than I have ever seen it, and a man working alone with your particular set of skills does not produce that result." The word skills landed with a weight Stroud may or may not have intended. Josiah kept his face still. From inside the kitchen, the sound of Ada moving the coffee pot on the stove. From the corral, Nate's voice talking low to the mare as he brushed her. Stroud leaned against the porch post. He was not unkind. But he was a man who had spent 20 years learning which levers moved which doors. "The Stock Association meets in November. I sit on the health committee. A cattleman on government grass who cannot maintain his herd and will not pay someone qualified to do it is a matter the committee takes seriously because disease on leased range becomes every leaseholder's concern." He paused. "I am not threatening you, Josiah. I am telling you what the committee asks about." The threat was delivered gently, and it was real. The association controlled access to the grass. A report from Stroud would not destroy Josiah, but it would require him to explain, in front of men whose opinion he valued, a deficiency he had hidden for 2 years. "Who is doing your doctoring?" Before Josiah could speak, Nate came around the corner of the house. The boy did not run. He walked up the porch steps with the unhurried purpose of someone who has heard enough and has decided what to do about it. He crossed the porch, went through the front door, and Josiah heard his boots on the floorboards, quick and steady, moving toward the back room. He came out 15 seconds later, carrying the medicine chest in both arms. The pine box with the sliding lid. Aniki's handwriting on the bottle labels inside. The boy held it against his ribs the way a man carries something that belongs to him. He walked past his father. He walked past Stroud. He went down the porch steps and across the yard to where Ada stood near the kitchen garden gate with the hoe resting against her shoulder, and he set the chest on the ground at her feet. Then he turned and faced Doc Stroud. "She does it." 3 words, spoken in the flat register of a child stating something so plainly true that the need to say it felt like an affront to everyone present. She does all of it. She fixed the heifer that was lame in the summer. She fixed the calf that scoured in June. She got up in the night when the gray mare was colicking, and she walked her until the sun came up, and she gave her the drench, and she cleaned everything after and put it all back, and she never told anyone. The boy stopped. He was breathing hard, not from the weight of the chest, but from the size of the thing he had released into the air. She does it, and she is good at it, and you should stop coming out here asking my pa for money because he does not need you anymore. The yard went silent. A meadowlark called from the fence wire near the corral. The wind moved the grass in the near pasture, and the sound of it was the sound of a country that did not care about the trouble of the people on it. Stroud studied the boy. He studied Ada standing behind the medicine chest with the hoe still balanced on her shoulder. He studied Josiah. Is that the truth? Josiah's chest was tight. His 8-year-old son had just stripped bare, in front of the one man best positioned to use the information. The inadequacy Josiah had spent 2 years walling off from the world, and the boy had done it not to expose his father, but to protect her. It is. Stroud put the account book into his bag. He studied Ada the way a man studies a colleague whose credentials he is evaluating. Where did you learn? My father kept dairy stock in Wisconsin. 60 head. He could not afford professional help. He taught me from the time I could hold a drench bottle, the colic preparation. Patent or your own? My own. Linseed oil, turpentine, and a half measure of salt dissolved in warm water. For a horse above 900 pounds, I add a quarter measure of dried ginger. Stroud was quiet for a long time. He buckled his bag. The $12 stands, Fen. Bring it when you are able. He untied his horse. He mounted. He rode down the track toward the river road, and what he carried with him was the knowledge that the Fen operation was being held together by a housekeeper who could do things Josiah Fen could not, and the knowledge sat on him lightly enough that he did not look back. Josiah stood on the porch. Nate stood beside the medicine chest with his hands at his sides. Ada had not moved. That morning he had put the money on the table and told her the arrangement was finished. He had meant it. The boy was too attached. The town would eventually talk. The arrangement was becoming something he had not agreed to and could not govern, and the safest thing was to end it before the cost of keeping it grew larger than the cost of letting it go. And now his son had carried his dead wife's medicine chest into the yard and placed it at this woman's feet and told the county's horse doctor that she was the reason the operation still functioned. Josiah went into the house. He took the deed box from the shelf above the bed and carried it to the kitchen table where the 4 silver dollars and the column of dimes sat untouched. He opened the box and removed the brand registration, the single sheet of paper that identified him to the stock association and the bank and the territorial recorder as the owner of the cattle on the government lease. Aniki's name had been on it once. He had crossed it out after the funeral with a single line of ink, because the recorder required the amendment, and drawing that line had been the worst thing he had done in his life. He went to the barn and found the ink bottle and the pen he used for accounts. He brought them to the kitchen table. He sat down and wrote Ada Kralale in the space below his name, in the line where Aniki's name had been, and the ink was the same ink, and the pen was the same pen. And the act of writing a woman's name into that space felt like both a betrayal and a repair, and he did not know how to separate the two, and did not try. He opened the front door. Nate came first. Ada followed, still carrying the hoe, the medicine chest left on the packed dirt where the boy had set it. Josiah pushed the brand registration across the table. The name on this paper controls the brand, the herd, and the lease. The stock association honors it. The bank honors it. If something happens to me, the person named here decides what becomes of the cattle. Ada set the hoe against the doorframe. She picked up the paper and read it. You set money out this morning to send me away. I did. Now my name is on your brand. It is. That is not a small thing, Josiah, no. Why? He picked up the 4 silver dollars and the column of dimes and returned them to the tin on the shelf where he kept the household money. He closed the tin. He turned back. Because the boy is right, and because you got up in the dark when the mare was colicking, and you walked her until dawn, and you gave her the drench, and you cleaned everything and put it back, and you never said a word. Any person who does that belongs to this place more than a man who could not open the chest. Nate pulled out his chair and sat. He lifted his slate from his knees and turned it face up and set it on the table between the brand registration and the plate he had laid for her that morning. On the slate, in the careful block letters of a boy who had been practicing his penmanship against this exact moment, were 2 words. Ada Fenn, not Crail. Fenn, he had given her the family name before anyone thought to offer it. Because an 8-year-old boy does not understand the distance between what is true and what has been spoken, and to Nate it had been true for months. The first frost came 3 weeks later. Ada moved the medicine chest from the back room to the kitchen, where the morning light was stronger and the warmth from the stove kept the linseed oil from thickening in the bottle. She relabeled every container in her own handwriting, not because Anaki's labels were incorrect, but because a woman who doctors a herd under her own authority needs to find what she needs by her own hand in poor light. Josiah did not object. He built a shelf for the chest above the stove, fitted with a raised lip so the bottles would not slide when the door opened hard in winter, and he planed the wood smooth and rubbed it with beeswax until it held the light. Nate still set her place every morning. He still turned the fork tines left. Some mornings, when the light was early and the first sound in the house was the coffee pot beginning to murmur on the stove, Josiah came into the kitchen and found both places set, his and hers, side by side at the table, and the boy already out on the porch, step in his boots, waiting to walk her to the henhouse in the cold. The slate stayed on the kitchen table. Nobody erased it. Nobody moved it to the shelf or turned it face down. The letters faced up, and the light from the window crossed them every morning when Ada set the coffee pot on the stove and Nate came down the stairs in his socks to lay the plates. By November, the pencil marks had faded to a soft gray that looked as though they had always been there, as though the table had produced them on its own, the way it produced warmth when the stove was lit and silence when the house was still.